Mikey Smith from the Mirror while we all wait for that news conference in Paris where that lineup of European defence ministers are there, speaking now, ready, we're hoping they're going to clue us in on what they've been deciding about the idea of supporting a ceasefire in Ukraine. That's if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine. Well, we'll find out the first part of that conundrum, at least what those ministers are going to be telling us as they're speaking now. We'll keep you right up to speed here on Pienaar Friends on Times Radio. Now, though, let's get the news with Martin Williams.
Sir Keir Starmer says all options are on the table when it comes to 25% taxes imposed on steel sent to America.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, and via your smart speaker.
John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive with NatWest Cushion.
It is good to have your company here on Pienaar and Friends. An hour of good conversation in very good company, which tonight, well, it's practically a symposium here in the studio. We've got Robert Fox, the defence editor at The Standard, on the line. We've got Major General Tim Cross, and we're joined, not for the first time, good to see them both here joining us now. We've got Mikey Smith from the Mirror. Good to see you, Mikey.
Hello.
Hi, and Joe Tanner, political strategist. Always lovely to hear you and see you, Joe. How you doing?
Hello.
So, look, we are all waiting then to plug into that news conference in Paris where that lineup of 5 European defence ministers, including John Healey, the British Defence Secretary, are sharing their thoughts on what they have been talking about over the course of the day. And that was after yesterday's meeting of uniformed defence chiefs in Paris. The subject on the table: what do you do about a ceasefire? If there's a ceasefire, how do you police and enforce that ceasefire? And that means military support from Britain, from France, and from, well, other countries too, in different ways. Now, either way, before we go back to Robert and to Tim, Mikey and Joe, looking at it from your perspectives, I mean, through political eyes, not simply defence eyes or foreign policy eyes, we can mark what a big moment this is politically, and if you like, in history too. We're talking about, a global crisis, and Britain playing very much a central role in it, apart from anything else, involving the deployment of troops into the line, or potentially into harm's way, Mikey. This is big stuff.
It is big stuff. It's potentially big stuff. If it all comes off, it is big stuff.
Yeah.
I'm afraid my optimism has drained somewhat over the last week or so. We are seeing reports that A, Russia is probably not going to accept the ceasefire, and B, even if it does, it's going to come to the table when we get to the negotiations, and they're going to come with all sorts of unreasonable requests that no reasonable negotiator could possibly agree to.
Yes. And
you've got to hope that, obviously, John Healey's been doing his thing with his foreign counterparts today. We've got a big chat at the weekend, a video call with Keir Starmer and the coalition of the willing. You've got to hope someone's working on a plan B. Yeah. Is the only thing I can think about today.
Yeah, maybe a C, D and E as well. I mean, Joe Tanner, what are you making of this moment?
Well, it's big, and I think Mikey makes a really valid point. I also think the other thing that we haven't necessarily considered fully is the reaction of MPs back home. And I've already heard a bit of unease developing from some MPs that have got, areas, they've got troops that are currently stationed in their patches, and they're worried about what this will look like and actually how thought through the plan is, how, I don't want to say safe, because I'm not sure any troops are ever safe, but sort of the parameters, whether this is actually something that's got the potential to work. Because as Mikey says, there are so many variables that, when we have this situation of troops on the ground and there's a conversation back with Parliament about what we do or don't do, there's always that unpredictability of how MPs will react. And I think for some MPs, there's genuine concern about what we may be signing up to.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. And some of that is just what you might anticipate at Westminster. Look, we haven't yet heard from Russia, of course. We did just a short while ago hear from President Trump in Washington. Now, he weighed in with his assessment of where we are.
We had a great success yesterday. We have a full ceasefire if it kicks in. We have to see. It's up to Russia now. But we've had a good relationship with both parties, actually. And we'll see. We'll be knowing people are going to Russia right now as we speak. And hopefully we can get a ceasefire from Russia. And if we do, I think that would be 80% of the way to getting this horrible bloodbath finished. It's a bloodbath is taking place over there.
Since Donald Trump, putting a certain optimistic gloss on things, the president sent Steve Witkoff, his envoy, to Moscow. And about that, Donald Trump, again, sounded optimistic about the Russian response.
We haven't spoken to him yet with substance, because we just found out and we just were able to get Ukraine to agree. So we're going to know very soon. I've gotten some positive messages, but a positive message means nothing. This is a very serious situation. This is a situation that could lead to World War III. And Biden should have never let it happen. Incompetence allowed this to happen.
Donald Trump there. Well, I spoke just a short while ago to a Russia security expert, Sergei Rodchenko, and asked what he thought the Kremlin's response would turn out to be.
Putin has two options. One, to continue fighting. He wants to effectively reassert Russia's control over Ukraine, and he's not backed down from those objectives. That's one thing. On the other hand, he also is looking for a good relationship with the United States. Yeah. He is hoping that the United States will lift sanctions on Russia. So sort of snubbing this proposals would mean that he would humiliate Donald Trump and potentially lead Donald Trump to give more support to Ukraine. Or perhaps impose new sanctions on Russia, and that would not be pretty for Putin. So I think what he will do is he will accept this proposal and begin negotiations, but then ask the Americans to effectively arm twist President Zelensky into accepting Russia's demands on Ukraine. Yeah. And when President Zelensky does not do so, then Putin will turn right around and say, look, we have been so reasonable and now we have no choice but to continue fighting.
It's Professor Sergei Rodchenko. Then I also spoke to the former Prime Minister of Ukraine, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who sounded, well, to put it mildly, sceptical.
In real terms, Russians gained just 0.5% in the last year of Ukrainian territory. And they lost hundreds of thousands of their military personnel. Yes. They are out of tanks, of artillery, of hardware, and the rest of the stuff. But the perception over this so-called Russian population is that we are winning. So he has to walk a very tight rope. So my guess is that, once again, he is to accept the ceasefire proposal on the basis of conditions he is to unfold. And then the next most dangerous stage is to appear. They will drag us into some kind of never-ending talks and negotiations.
And he argued, well, just unstitch from there on, renege, go backwards, eventually blame the other side for the failure of that deal. That's Arseniy Yatsenyuk, the former Prime Minister of Ukraine. Robert Fox, you were saying just a moment ago, we're still waiting for the way to hear from the British Defence Secretary John Healey. His turn's going to come in a minute. They're going down the line, each speaking in their own language. But we'll get you to John Healey as soon as that happens. While we're talking about our expectations, Robert, you were talking about, well, don't expect too much, and that's putting it mildly. We should not expect, you were arguing, very much at all.
I don't think we can expect too much at all, because I think this is the consensus I'm drawing away from everybody about it. We're not ready for it yet. Russia certainly isn't. How do you turn this enormous thing around? That it is committed to it's got a major war economy going. 630,000 personnel committed to the battlefront in depth. They may be in reserve back in Russia itself, 630,000, calling up 430,000. They're doing quite well with their annual conscription at the moment. But how long, with an ageing population, can this go on, particularly at the attrition rates that have been going on? Attrition rates have been terrible for Ukraine, but it is qualitative. There are various things that are happening. But there is a speculation about this time next year, if Russia still goes on at this rate, then things really do give. And that's where, long-term, things are really quite dicey for Putin, because more and more to commit himself to this wartime economy, he has to be committed to the support of Xi Jinping and China, of course. There are big things going there. It's all the way Trump is pitching it at the moment, the art of the deal. I don't think it comes around so quick as he thinks it is. This is not going to come clean. It's not going to come easy.
Right. I mean, Major General Tim Cross, when it comes to this multinational force, would it need to be on the ground in Ukraine? Would you need to have those cliched boots on the ground in Ukraine? Robert's arguing you can have a block of forces, a multinational block of forces based on the border. At the moment, we have got that at the moment, don't we? We've got forces on the Polish side of the Ukraine border. Yeah. It's an important hub there for transport. It's used to get weapons into Ukraine. Do they not need to be on the ground? Or could you just guard the air over Ukraine in a way that isn't happening now from the other side of the border?
Well, I think, again, we come back to, what is the intent here? But where I'm sitting on this is, if you want to secure, if Zelensky wants to be clear and Ukraine wants to have a sense of, real security, you're going to have some sort of force on the ground inside Ukraine. Now, there may be some sort of demilitarized zone, or there may be something at the front with something else happening, but you've got to have these people on the ground. Now, going back to an earlier point that was made about plans, one of the great mantras in the British Army is, of the three plans you think about, it's always the fourth that happens. Events drive this stuff. And it's no point in pretending that if we are going to put this force on the ground inside Ukraine, it is going to have to be prepared to engage in military operations. A worst case, high-intensity warfighting. And you cannot possibly put British troops or anybody else's troops into Ukraine on anything other than that basis. Hopefully, it won't get to that stage. But you can't, we can't put British soldiers into Ukraine thinking that there won't be a shot being fired, or we're simply going to observe what's going on. That's not the way these things pan out. It's never panned out like that on any of the deployments I've been involved with. So I think you've got to have troops on the ground. They've got to have clear rules of engagement. You've got to have a clear understanding of what they're there to do, and then give them the material support, the logistics and everything else that's going to need to sustain them. And you've got to be prepared for them to be there for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, Putin, as I said, as we're all saying, really, is going to play a long game here. And I think this force, if it goes in, and I'm not, Putin again has said that he doesn't want any troops from NATO countries in there, so he may or may not give way on that. But if anything goes in the ground, they're going to have to be prepared to be there for a long time. And sustaining that over a long period of time is going to be really tough.
Yeah, I mean, it's about manpower, it is about resources, but also you make a really important point there. If it turns out that, let's take Britain as the big example, that we commit forces on the ground in Ukraine, you say they have to be ready to fight. They have to be ready to fight Russia. Just pause and just reflect on that for a moment. Deploying British troops who would be ready to fight Russia. That's when you get into World War III territory, isn't it? Anyway, we'll come back on that in a moment because I think we need to. Tim Cross, do stay there if you can. Robert Fox, always great to have you here. Mikey Smith and Joe Tanner. And we're watching that briefing room in Paris. When we get to John Healey, who'll tell us something maybe in terms that we can actually hear without a translation, we're going to bring that to you. I promise you will miss nothing. You're listening to Pienaar Friends on Times Radio in association with NatWest Cushion, making workplace pensions and savings easy. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more.
Times Radio.
To discover more about how a gift young lives.
Putting your employees in control.
With me on Pienaar and Friends, Robert Fox, defence editor at The Standard, Mikey Smith from the Mirror, Joe Tanner, political strategist, and Major General Tim Cross, former senior British Army commander. Tim, I'm going to come back to you first now, while we're still waiting to hear from John Healey, the Defence Secretary in Paris at that Defence Ministers' conference. He's going to be next, by the way. They're on the Polish Defence Minister now. Apparently, John Healey's going to be next. When he speaks, you will hear it. Tim Cross, you made a big point earlier on, which was this. If it is to be that the British government are to deploy British soldiers on the ground in Ukraine, it means being ready to fight Russians. And I guess there's a straight line of logic to that, isn't there, Tim? Because if they're there as any kind of deterrent, well, that's the clear implication of it. You can't deploy with the idea of those forces withdrawing, maybe reporting, or whatever it happens to be. If there's a conflict in the east of the country, deterrent means deterrent, and the deterrent means that you'd fight if you have to.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Which is why at one end of the spectrum, as we were saying earlier, Putin will want some sort of equivalent of a UN peacekeeping force there to observe only. He'll want the rules of engagement. He'll want the criteria to exclude the idea of anybody's going to be allowed to use force. But as we saw in Afghanistan, you remember when we deployed to Afghanistan, there was, and I don't want to be unfair to the politicians who made the comment, but we hoped to be able to go there and not have to fire a shot. Well, these things don't survive for long. So you cannot go in and expect to be not engaged unless the criteria for the force, unless the agreement, I don't know, around the UN Security Council or in the agreements between UK, US, Russia and Ukraine are such that the force is not going to be there to do anything other than observe and report back to somebody. And that force has to be controlled by somebody. We have a core headquarters equivalent at the ARC based here in the UK. If we deploy a force the size and shape that's going to be required from a number of nations, it has to have serious command and control capability, who then act as the interface between the politicians and the troops on the ground. We go around the same circle, John, but you're going to have to be prepared to fight if necessary. And I do wonder whether people, we've touched on earlier on, our MPs, our constituents and so forth, will really want to be prepared or want to see British troops put in this situation where we may end up by having a serious fight with Russia.
Right. Well, Debs has written in, our listener, Debs. Thanks, Debs. She says, well, surely the whole premise of NATO is to be prepared to fight Russia. British troops take part in training in places like Estonia to ensure they can fight Russia on territory they recognise. Why now all this hand-wringing over something we've ostensibly been prepping for 80 years? The reality is scary, British troops engaging, but the fact that it's getting coy about it isn't going to stop that happening if the USA isn't there. Well, Deb's thoughts. I mean, Joe Tanner, we're getting back to the area. I know that we are speculating because that's naturally what we're going to do, Joe, but these are active thoughts in the minds of a lot of people, including politicians at Westminster you've been talking to, Joe. If we're saying that deploying British forces and others on the ground in Ukraine means basically putting them in the line of fire, ready to fight Russia, that's going to get the minds of a lot of MPs on both sides turning over.
Yeah, I think that is the crux of the issue. I think the fact that we've got a US president who is also sort of, changes his mind, is doing things and then sort of changing the goalposts and will have an influence, even if not part of that force, even if that is just the coalition of the willing and that ends up just being an EU thing. Well, what happens when things change? And suddenly, does Trump then put pressure on the EU lot to do something? Do they then have to make some big decisions while those troops are on the ground? It just, a coalition of the willing is a great idea, but it's also incredibly complex to run and to sort of make decisions. Who is the command and control boss? Are you going to sort of get everyone on a conference call and you've got to change tack? Like, how does this all work in reality? And I think while we have seen, group deployments before and we've seen active service with different countries involved, I think the unpredictability of this situation is definitely making very many MPs uneasy. One MP said to me the other day, it didn't work out well for us the last time a Labour Prime Minister took us in to a conflict situation and referring to the Iraq War. And, I think it's a different situation, but it is about the fact that the reassurances that even this group want to receive, let alone MPs back in the UK want to receive before those troops go forward, they're just not there. It's just such a mixed picture.
Yeah, I mean, Mikey Smith, what are you picking up from MPs on both sides of the House of Commons? Now the idea, at least, of putting forces in harm's way is under active consideration.
Similar things to Joe. I think Joe's right that there is always trepidation when you're talking about putting boots on the ground in any conflict. The other thing I'm picking up is that MPs are a little cautious about what comes immediately next after whatever ceasefire, if any, is agreed. That's when you start the negotiations and that's when you start talking about territory. And obviously, Ukraine is going to be saying, yes, we're not going to give up any of our territory. Russia is saying, look, we've captured this territory, this is our territory, and we'd really quite like to have the rest of Ukraine, please, because we don't think it's a real country. And I think there is a danger, and I think there is a concern that if you give any ground, literally, to Putin, that sends a terrible message about how countries are expected to conduct themselves in the world.
Yes.
If you cede territory to an invading force, which hasn't really happened, certainly in Europe, for a very, very long time, what message does that send to other nations around the world?
OK, we're going to cross now live to Paris. John Healey, the Secretary of State for Defence, at the podium and speaking. Let's go there.
To President Trump and President Zelensky for this breakthrough. The Ukrainians want peace, we all want peace. And as defence ministers, we have been discussing and we are working to strengthen the push for peace. And I say to President Putin, over to you now. You said you want to talk, prove it. Accept the ceasefire, start negotiations and end the war. And make no mistake, the pressure is now on Putin. And today we meet as the defence ministers of the E5 nations, the 5 largest defence spenders amongst the European nations of NATO. We know our responsibility. We know we must step up on Ukraine, on defence spending, on European security, and on all fronts. We are and we will further. And on stepping up on Ukraine, the focus for the majority of our discussions together today. This year the UK will spend £4.5 billion in military aid to Ukraine, the highest level ever. The UK and France are jointly leading work on plans to drive the push for peace and drive the arrangements for security guarantees for Ukraine. We're doing this work together. We're cooperating closely with partner nations, and we're looking to build a coalition of the willing from Europe and beyond. And from today, we are accelerating that work. Yesterday, military chiefs from 34 nations, representatives from 37 nations met here in Paris, co-chaired by Admiral Radakin and by General Boucard, and attended for over an hour by President Macron. On Saturday, the UK Prime Minister will host a further summit of leaders, and our military leaders will meet again next week to continue the military planning with this wider network. And on stepping up on defence, 2 weeks ago, our UK Prime Minister announced that the UK will put in place the biggest increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. We will increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027 and 3% in the next Parliament. Between our 5 nations, we recognise that we must take on more responsibility for European security. So today in Paris we have agreed we must rearm, we must spend more, we must work together to strengthen our industrial base. Our industry must be capable of innovating at wartime pace and must make defence an engine for economic growth in each of our nations. It's our job as defence ministers to keep our countries safe, and in the coming weeks you'll see European allies coming ever closer together because our security is shared and our strength relies on that unwavering commitment to each other. And peace and stability in Europe will only be achieved through strengthening NATO and standing with Ukraine. That is what the 5 of us, as E5 defence ministers, are committed to securing. Thank you.
Well, that was John Healey there speaking live, the Secretary of State for Defence from the British government, one of the 5 ministers, the E5 group of European nations who've been meeting there in Paris, looking ahead to a ceasefire in Ukraine, if there's to be a ceasefire. The message from John Healey started very much directed at Vladimir Putin. He said, you said you want to talk, well, prove it. So the challenge was there. It's up to Vladimir Putin. He said the pressure was on the Russian leader to respond to the offer of a ceasefire thrashed out by the Ukrainians and by Americans in Saudi Arabia yesterday. Everyone waiting for that, which I guess accounts for the fact that that was very much a holding statement. He didn't tell us very much, if anything, that we didn't know already. So much there going on behind the scenes, the logistics of what they're talking about, the military relationships, and I guess the various permutations of what happens as and when Vladimir Putin gives his answer. Well, it is now 6:30 on Pienaar and Friends. Let's just take a pause and get the news now with Martin Williams.
John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive with NatWest Cushion. Empower your employees to feel good about their pension. Search NatWest Cushion today. Capital at risk.
And I'm John Pienaar. This is Pienaar and Friends. Here with me, Robert Fox, Major General Tim Cross, Mikey Smith and Joe Tanner. We are just pondering what is going on in Paris, what is going on in Moscow, what's going on in Washington. We're talking Ukraine, in other words, and we're waiting for Russia to have its say on that ceasefire proposal that we talked about on this programme yesterday. And until we get that, I guess we're talking about any number of different permutations of where we go from here. We're rehearsing and going through some of them on the programme this evening. And Kate Borsay is no doubt going to be doing something of the same at 7 o'clock when you take over, Kate.
Yeah, John, we are going to be watching closely for what might happen now. We've just heard from John Healey, of course, over in Paris. Donald Trump has doubled down this afternoon. He's been meeting the Taoiseach Michael Martin at the White House, and he a bit like these things go, they're there to talk about St. Patrick's Day. We knew we were going to hear about tariffs, but of course Donald Trump veers off in all sorts of different directions. And he was asked about what would happen if Russia did not sign up to the ceasefire agreement, and he has talked very strongly about the US could do things very bad for Russia financially, but wants peace. Trump says, if needed, there are things you can do that wouldn't be pleasant in a financial sense and would be very bad for Russia. We could do very bad things for Russia. It would be devastating, but I don't want to do that because I want to see peace. So there you go, a barb thrown out by Donald Trump towards Russia, who, as you correctly say, we are still waiting to hear from. Marco Rubio has also been talking today. He made a temporary stop off in Shannon to keep the island theme going. He didn't rule out European troops monitoring the temporary ceasefire earlier. So we asked Elina Valtonen, who is the Foreign Affairs Minister for Finland, about that. Finland's been very shy about getting involved in a coalition of the willing or getting boots onto the ground into Ukraine because they've got their own 800-mile border to monitor. She told me earlier that they are, of course, committed to a coalition of the willing, but said for Finland that doesn't necessarily mean boots on the ground. So we sort of pushed her a little bit further on that about Finland's commitment. They've been, of course, in terms of percentage of GDP and their own security concerns, they are very involved in all of these discussions. So you'll be hearing from her. We'll also be hearing from the German ambassador to the UK, Miguel Berger, in the show as well.
Good stuff, Kate. Coming up at 7 o'clock right here on Times Radio after this. Now, we'll just look at what we heard from John Healey there, which frankly was not a huge amount, which tells you, above all else, that we are in a kind of we're in circling mode, we're in waiting mode. The Defence Secretary just saying they're in Paris. It's up to you, Putin, now. You said you wanted to talk. Now talk. The challenge was there. He said a lot of things that we know are already part of the broad thinking of the government and governments across Europe and in the alliance behind Ukraine. You've got to spend more money on defence now. He spoke about Britain's commitment to go up from 2.3 to 2.5% of national earnings, then to 3% in the next parliament. Well, we knew, of course, that the aim to rearm, the aim to strengthen defences together as well as individually. And I guess here's the thing, to you first, Tim, if I could, because right now, as I speak, on various desks, but not yet published, I'm not sure it's yet finalised, not sure how it can be, you've got the big Strategic Defence Review. It's been put together by a team of General Sir Richard Barrons. You've got George Robertson, a former Secretary General of NATO. You've got Fiona Hill, a former respected American policy advisor. And what's going on with that review now? Because the ground is shifting beneath everybody's feet, Tim.
Yeah, it is. It is shifting, obviously, and it was originally due to come out about now, really, springtime. There is talk of it being delayed, and I suspect it's being delayed partly as a result of the indecision and the situation that we find ourselves in now. And it's interesting that John Healey didn't touch on that at all. I agree with you that he didn't actually add much, but he did say a couple of things which are not unimportant. One is that he's talked about driving the arrangements for security guarantees. Now, what does that mean? Ultimately, this is about Ukrainian sovereignty. Whether they retain the whole of the country or 80% of it, at the end of the day, retaining that sovereignty. And to do that, you are going to need to have hard power on the ground. Now, what does that look like? I think does relate back to the SDR, because if he's serious about that, then it may be that some of the things they're thinking about need to be redirected as a result of what they think is now going to happen in terms of supporting that security guarantee. It was interesting earlier on, too, that it was just mentioned that Finland were talking about monitoring. That takes us back to peacekeeping type UN operations, not the stuff that I've been talking about. And also, if you really are going to put hard power and you need to redirect some of these assets from an SDR point of view, This takes time. I mean, John Healey again stressed that he's putting it, or they are putting it, increasing defence by 2027 and 3% by the next parliament. Well, that could be 6-7 years away.
Yeah.
So in terms of the ability to deliver the sort of hard power that's going to be required to guarantee security in Ukraine, there's quite a bit of a disconnect there somewhere. And I don't get a warm feeling that we've really managed to think that through yet.
Really well put. And Robert Fox, this strategic defence review, I think the idea was to look 10 years into the future. Well, now we're talking about, looking 10 days, 10 weeks, 10 months into the future. The urgency is that 10 hours into the future. So whatever they've been thinking around that table over the strategic defence review, it looks very old now.
Well, defence reviews, like most battle plans, don't last the first 5 minutes of contact. The one that George Robertson did, which is seen as a model, not over well costed, though, the one of 98, the Strategic Defence Review, of course, was very rapidly overtaken by the events of 9/11. OK, it lasted them, and had to be rewritten to all intents and purposes there. In my experience, and I don't like the perpendicular pronoun me, but been in the business for over 50 years. I've never known a defence review that has been completely overtaken even before it's been printed, virtually. Yeah. And there's a general admission in Whitehall that this has happened. It's prepared, it's there, it's done. 2 or 3 things have happened, not only Ukraine, but this thing, but the expenditure, the budgeting has changed. Because at one point we were hearing before Christmas that Rachel from Accounts, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was saying, look, I'm not going to give you any more money. There's been a big turnaround because of the seriousness in Eastern Europe and, to a certain extent, what is going to happen in the Middle East. And by the way, here's a thing we're not watching, and we were caught napping the first time round. There's a prospect of another major offensive from the Houthis on the way, which does involve Britain as well. There's a problem with the defence review still. I think something will appear and will be said by Easter of this. This is my understanding. Mm-hmm. But the problem is, who is going to say what is going to be spent, where, how, and to what timetable? And there always is, as Mikey would know, the perpetual battle with the Treasury. And the Treasury here try to run policy. And I think that this is where the Prime Minister, we've seen him, he's become pragmatic, he's become vibrant in this, is really taking it over, saying, no, you are not going to have the last word this time. And the man who's going to crack the homework, and boy, he's been busy, and we must say all praise to him, he's been pretty successful, is going to be Jonathan Powell. Yeah. But I do think
even if it comes to the fine print of the Defence Review.
No, he's going to say, this goes, that goes. This is my advice with the Chief of the Defence Staff. This is my advice to the Prime Minister. This is what we've got to do. And I think by midsummer, we're going to have a new Chief of the Defence Staff. We're going to have a new configuration, which is what both Starmer and John Healey wants, who's playing a very strong hand here. Probably the biggest change in the Central Defence Staff since the Ministry of Defence became the Ministry of Defence, which was only back in 1957 with Mountbatten, but it's going to be a huge change.
Yes.
But I must say, I'm going to push back a little bit on what Tim was saying. Yeah. I don't expect dramatic increases of forces, dramatic increases of recruiting and personnel because they're having such trouble there. And they're going to be very, very cautious what they commit to in Eastern Europe. They have learnt the lessons. Britain and France are particularly good on this. What they learnt from the Balkans. The problem was that they had a mandate there from the UN Security Council. This is why you had the disaster of the safe zones like Srebrenica, but not just Srebrenica, because the UN Security Council mandated something that then the members didn't support. And I just have to say, just a kicker, the Dutch Parliament has voted narrowly by 3 votes not to support Ursula von der Leyen's call for 800 billion euros to go into defence, and even the Dutch subsidy of 3.5 billion euros currently to Ukraine. So there's trouble at mill there. And this is what we're going to have, I think, across Europe.
And they've got a veto over that.
I don't think that they will have a veto because it will now go to negotiation. Yeah. But what we were saying, and we were saying, this is not at all easy. This will not please Trump because this is where they want solidarity and dynamism from Europe. and it's going to be very, very tricky indeed. And it plays absolutely to the tactical planning as well as the overall strategy of Vladimir Putin.
Okay, Robert Fox, really great to get your thoughts, as it always is. Do come back and see us again now. You're here, he said in his best sort of southern accent. And Major General Tim Cross, always a pleasure. Again, same to you, Tim. Come back and see us any time. I think we're going to be calling on you before very, very long. We're going to carry on the conversation in just a moment with Mikey Smith from the Mirror, Joe Tanner. And we're going to be talking, we're just turning our attention to another big, big story today, which is the world economy, which is trade, which is a trade war, which is pretty much well underway now. North and south between America and its Canadian neighbour, building up between America and Europe on the other side of the Atlantic. And there are we in the middle, hoping for the best from our own point of view. I don't know how sustainable that's going to turn out to be. We'll look at that in a bit more detail as well on Pienaar and Friends, here on Times Radio, in association with NatWest Cushion, putting your employees in control of their financial future. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more. Smith from the Mirror and Joe Tanner, political strategist. We're going to turn our attention now, and yours, I hope, to trade, to a trade war, which is really, really building up now between Donald Trump's Washington and the Canadian neighbour and the European Union. And we're just sort of hoping not to be scathed too heavily by all of this. I mean, Mikey Smith, obviously serious worry about this. I mean, the EU, after those steel and aluminium tariffs, now they're escalating it on the European side as well, putting more tariffs on American goods, I think, as well. That's coming now too. This is going to keep on building and building and building. It's going to have an effect on the world economy. It's going to have an effect on global trade. It's going to hurt economies on all sides, including ours, as we get sucked into all of this. How do you read the thinking about this in Downing Street?
I mean, the thinking currently is that we are not going to retaliate. Yeah. There's no sense that whatever tariffs Trump slaps on us, particularly on steel, that there's any intention to retaliate with Trump, because obviously we need to keep him on side and play nice because we're the bridge between Europe and Donald Trump currently. That causes a bit of a problem for us, because a big thing with Labour is reinvigorating Britain's steel industry, which is obviously going to be a bit of a problem if we can't export any of it to America, which we do. Now, I know Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds has met with the US envoy a couple of times to talk about steel tariffs. That has apparently not gone super well because they're still putting steel tariffs on us. And we're going into negotiating this thing. Excuse me. We're going into negotiating this thing with, we've already said no retaliation, so that's off the table, even though number 10 kind of says, oh, everything's on the table. It's not. And we're going in, we've already offered them a state visit. So we're going in with a really, really weak hand because everyone knows we're not going to fight back. And we're kind of in a position now where we're just going to have to grin and bear these tariffs.
Relying on goodwill.
Exactly. And that's where we are.
Yeah. I'm going to get the thoughts now because we're joined now live on the line from stateside by Gavin Bade, who's the Wall Street Journal's trade and economic policy reporter, a friend of the programme. Welcome back, Gavin. Good to talk to you.
Great to talk to you, John. Happy to be here.
Good to hear your voice. Gavin, look, I want to start with that British-focused angle. I mean, here in London, the British government are hoping to just escape the worst of this tit-for-tat trade war that's building up. Did you get any sense of the thinking in Washington, D.C. about Britain's position in all of this?
Unfortunately, I think the thinking in Washington right now is that Britain is not necessarily top of mind. I mean, we've seen retaliatory tariffs today from the European Union. We've seen other trade disputes with Canada and Mexico going on. And so I think that Britain is maybe in the back of Trump's mind right now. Certainly you haven't invited his ire as like the European Union did today. But I think, there are other fish for them to fry, so to speak, at this point.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Tanner, I mean, some of the corporates that you advise, I'm guessing they must be worried about this stuff, aren't they?
I think everyone's worried, John. That's the problem. I mean, the companies are very concerned about what's going to happen. They're trying to think about how they can mitigate the situation. And they have been doing that because this idea of Trump has threatened other countries, done something, then said he's not going to do something. This sort of unpredictability is actually the worst of all worlds for all business because you just don't know where you stand. This is also all against a backdrop, remember, of this constant narrative, which I know I bang on about a lot when we talk, is about the fact that this UK government are trying to attract businesses here and want people to do things here. And of course, then if you've got this problem about how you then interact with the US, it's incredibly problematic. And that is, it's a significant plank of the government's growth strategy. Yeah. So, you can forgive Rachel Reeves to some extent for sort of being incredibly cautious and probably a bit worried.
Yes.
Where she can make decisions. We've got this spring statement. It's 2 weeks today. And we are in the most incredibly unpredictable sort of times in terms of business planning, financial planning, the economic planning that the government have got to do, and all the big decisions queuing up. So, I think I can understand why the government are sitting tight, but at the same, this idea that Keir Starmer is performing this bridge role, which is exactly, Mikey Smith sort of said this was part of what Keir Starmer's strategy was. We all worried that bridges are things you walk over, you drive over. Yeah. We do want to be in that position, and that's incredibly tough now.
Yeah, I mean, nobody wins a trade war, and people get sucked in. Chris Southworth, he's the General Secretary of the International Chambers of Commerce UK. I spoke to him earlier on, and he talked about the damage from a trade war, including to the US economy.
Obviously, companies won't want to be open about this, but I'll be absolutely amazed if any investor is now not pausing investment in the US because it's just unclear what is going on. That will absolutely impact the US economy, and I'll be absolutely amazed that any foreign companies aren't looking at the US now as an unstable, unpredictable place to do business and will be therefore looking elsewhere. And that's terrible for the US economy.
That's got to be ominous for America. And now listen to this, because on CBS News in America, the US Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, he was asked if these trade policies were worth it, if it led to a recession.
These policies are the most important thing America has ever had.
So it is worth it.
It is worth it. I don't think the only reason there could possibly be a recession is because of the Biden nonsense that we had to live with. These policies produce revenues, they produce growth, they produce factories being built here.
Gavin Bade at the Wall Street Journal. It's a sort of comment from a politician that makes your eyes pop out just for a moment. I mean, some of us are old enough to remember in British politics a former chancellor who spoke about unemployment being a price worth paying. Remember that, Mikey? Now, that caused a stir. And now you've got an American cabinet minister, Gavin, saying a recession, a price worth paying. My goodness, what can you say about that?
I can say a few things. I think, first of all, and we had some reporting on this morning, not everyone is very happy with how the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, is handling this. He's been a bit cavalier. He's been going on television shows sometimes multiple times a day and saying things, getting ahead of the rest of the cabinet, getting ahead of Trump. And you've heard Trump say himself, oh, we don't think there will be a recession. So he may have gotten a little bit out over his skis here. But I think, stepping back for a moment, it's almost as if the Trump administration is trying to run the sort of neoliberal shock therapy prescription that we saw the U.S. and other Western nations apply to the former Soviet republics back in the early 90s. You know, they're going to dramatically slash public spending, privatize maybe parts of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and at the same time, you know, totally rethink our trading relationships with the rest of the world. And I think they do this so fast so that they can, as Howard Lutnick said there, try to blame it on the Biden administration, even though they are the ones making these big changes.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Tanner, I'm just imagining, from what I know of you, what would you say to a government minister who'd gone out in front of cameras in an interview and said recession was a price worth paying?
I'd probably put my resignation in for a start, John, I think, if I was working for them. But, you know, I think that is where we are in these incredibly extraordinary times where the American politicians, Trump is leading from the front in this sort of completely cavalier attitude, and it you know, not just on the economy but on everything, on, you know, matters of sort of global safety, global security. Like, there's just this sense of not really any sort of regard for the consequences. It's just kind of do yeah. And we'll just, you know, we can blame everyone else when it goes wrong, and it just doesn't wash. You know, interestingly, there's a real sense, you know, Liz Truss and her real cavalier attitude about all the things she did and how it wasn't her fault, it was everyone else's fault that it went wrong. There is this real sense of you have these actions, but actually you're then not responsible for what happens. It's the other forces. You know, is he going to blame umpteen newspapers and goodness knows what, as Liz Truss did, you know, for the reaction. And interesting, you know, Elon Musk's response to some of what Trump's doing was to say, I'm going to commit to building even more cars in America, or even more tech, build more than ever. But no one's buying them now. Trump's had to buy one just to try and provide some support to his mate for the fact that people don't want to buy them. There's been a boycott. Yeah, well, that is there was this bizarre. While you mentioned that, there was this bizarre scene at the White House where Donald Trump basically staged with Elon Musk a kind of a commercial for Tesla electric car. Just have a listen to this.
Yeah, so all these cars won incredible awards. So they're great cars and they're American made. And I think, you know, try it. You'll like it.
And I should say, beyond the cars, they're great. But we have to celebrate somebody that has the courage to do this. He could have said, I'm not doing anything. I'm not going to get involved. Let the country go to hell. He didn't want to do that.
And all of that was going on outside the White House, on the sort of on the driveway outside the White House. There was, what was it, 1, 2, 3, I don't know, Tesla cars there, high-end cars. How many there were? Five, Mikey tells me. And Donald Trump was standing there like an extra in a TV commercial. I mean, Gavin Bade, I know we're losing our capacity for our eyes to pop out of our heads, but what did you think when you see that sort of thing, the White House as the stage for a commercial, with the president as one of the actors?
Yeah, it does strike you as a bit of cronyism, right, for someone that, you know, whose stock price has plummeted precipitously in the recent weeks in Elon Musk and Tesla, right? You know, it does seem like President Trump is, you know, in your parlance, putting up for his mate here and saying, you know, we're going to try to support you. It is also just surreal to me that, you know, 10 years ago, Elon Musk was a liberal champion, and the fact that you have a very fossil fuel heavy president standing in front of the White House saying, please drive an electric vehicle so that we can own the libs, so to speak, so that we can get one over on the liberals, is just quite surreal for me to see. So we're in upside down land here in Washington.
Upside down, through the looking glass. Nothing is what it ever used to be. Nothing is normal anymore. Gavin Bale of the Wall Street Journal, thank you so much as always. Mikey Smith and Joe Tanner, great to talk to you. And thanks to you for listening. Angus Mitchell was our producer. Our technical operators, Isaac Marley and Robert Warren. I'm going to be back tomorrow. Who knows what tomorrow brings? Who knows what 7 o'clock's going to bring? We'll find out in just a minute. Kate Borsay is up next on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
Have a great evening. It is Kate Borsay. It's 7 o'clock and it's the evening edition. Coming up.
In a financial sense, yeah, we could do things very bad for Russia. It would be devastating for Russia, but I don't want to do that because I want to see peace.
That was Donald Trump's warning to Vladimir Putin if a temporary ceasefire deal is not accepted. We'll bring you reaction to that Paris meeting of European defence chiefs as they talk about